Hey guys, this is Jay Calderon with Jay Unboxing, giving you a bit of a rundown of the past weekend, or at least some of the highlights. And we've had some interesting fights, some news. A fight or two have been announced. Of course, that being the Canelo Alvarez versus Billy Joe Saunders unification bout taking place on May 8th later this year. And there's so much to get into here, so let's get into this with our top story. Of course, the demolition job performed by Canelo Alvarez on mandatory challenger Avni Yildirim. So first things first, this of course is going to be talked about from every different angle. And why did the fight happen? Shouldn't Canelo be facing better opposition? So many different questions so many people have, and these all seem valid until you realize that this is how the boxing world works in many respects. You have to pick your poison no matter how bright your star. Unless we have a singular champion per division, obviously, we will have to have multiple champions, and as a result of that, fighters will have to round up those titles to claim undisputed status. And there are pros and cons to that target, I suppose, but what I will say is that I appreciate when a fighter makes that sort of effort. I recently read an article where there was this premise that Canelo shouldn't be facing Saunders and Caliplant, both titleists, but instead should be taking on David Benavidez and Demetrius Andre, two guys who do not have titles, at 168 pounds. All of these fighters are great fighters, by the way, but the problem is that the two fighters they said he should fight, Benavidez and Andrade, or Andrade, however he wants to say his name this week, have as much credibility as Plant and Saunders do, but they don't have the gold. In other words, you had in the past Benavidez lined up to fight Plant. That was one of the rumored bouts, and it never took place, and now you have Plant with the title. You had a similar bout between Billy Joe Saunders and Demetrius. Didn't take place, but of course now Saunders has a belt at the weight Canelo finds himself at. He's facing the two with the titles, both of whom were matched up fairly evenly against the other preferred fighters on this guy's list. The point being, you can never please everyone. Some might think Benavidez and Andrade have a better shot. Some would say Caliplant and Saunders have a better shot. It's hard to make that kind of distinction. And at the end of the day, even if he went on and fought Benavidez and fought Andrade, he'd still have Plant, he'd still have Saunders there with titles that he'd have to beat to begin with. It would make no difference. It's a reason few fighters have unified all the belts, and it's hard as hell to do. When you have the biggest name in the sport, that makes it a little bit easier to accomplish that, and fighters are more willing to fight you again and use those championships as leverage, and of course, stars have to use that to their advantage. And again, any of these fights is a good thing. I don't mind it at all. I just don't mind if he has a trilogy matchup with Gennady Golovkin, or if he moves up to 175 pounds and faces Dmitry Bivol and Artur Beterbiev, or whoever it might be, but at the same time, he cannot do all of this all at once. The Yildirim situation, regardless of how you look at this, was a necessary evil, one way or another. Either he takes on the mandatory, and thus we are left with the blowout that we saw Saturday, or he vacates, Yildirim faces someone the likes of the aforementioned Benavidez, or even someone like a David Lemieux, if that fight can't be made, a fight I'm not all that interested in or impressed with. And if Yildirim loses, which I think he probably loses either of those two fights, then you have Lemieux at 168 pounds, who's even less effective than he was at 160 fighting Canelo. Or you have the Benavidez fight, which again, makes all the sense in the world at that point. He would have a title, but that's a perfect example of the sort of the way fans talk out of both sides of their mouth as it pertains to Canelo. In that case, you would say, fight Benavidez. He has the title. You should be fighting. Well, that's what he's trying to do now, but now you're saying he should be fighting other people. Whereas if he was fighting them, it's, well, he should be trying to unify. You can't do all of this all at once. And, this is not even mentioning the fact that if he fought someone like a Benavidez, he's not even going to get all the credit in the world, because Benavidez is coming off of a failed drug test for cocaine and a suspension, and he doesn't have a championship belt to begin with. So he's giving him less of a credible look on paper after the fact, especially if Canelo wins the fight, and potentially, just as much trouble as anyone else, except he doesn't have a title. Whereas if he does wait and lets him fight a Yildirim, he wins the title, then Benavidez, coming from a disadvantageous position, has even more leverage during negotiation now. There's just no way that Canelo wins in these situations, so he has to set a clear path, and in this case he's decided those who have the titles are the ones I'm going after. At the end of the day, you have to remember he's fighting 4 times He beat the #1 guy at the weight who had the world championship. Now he's trying to round up all the other belts, fighting 2 unbeaten, highly skilled fighters that many other fighters in the past have avoided, and he's trying to get all of this accomplished before his 4th fight this year. He's 30 years old. If he gets all of that accomplished by the end of this year and fights 4 times in the process, it's really difficult for me to look at that and discredit him for that kind of approach. The other thing you have to remember is these fighters like a Demetrius Andrade, like a Benavidez, they have to try to build their star up in the interim. They have that opportunity. They could be 2 guys that could fight each other. And were one to obviously beat the other, it'd certainly make them a prime candidate for a fight in 2022, which is right around the corner, a lot faster. It will be approaching than you expect. Also, I'd like to retouch on another issue that I had earlier on Saturday, which was my assessment of Joseph Parker's bout with Junior Fa, which took place in Auckland, New Zealand. And I suppose calling it a relatively dull encounter, maybe irked some people, and they thought I might have been a little too harsh in my criticism of their temperament, and them being too friendly, so on and so forth. And look, this isn't an argument about them being bad human beings or about them being poor boxers. This is an argument about whether or not either man has the mental makeup to snatch up a win during a close fight where being the meaner of the 2 men possibly gets you across the finish line first. When you're so preoccupied with ensuring you're a nice guy that you just won't be the first one to get a little dirty if you have to. You're just vulnerable at the top level. I'm not saying everyone has to be willing to bend the rules to a Bernard Hopkins level or an Evander Holyfield level, but you need to be able to fight when boxing isn't working. And that has been the rap on Parker for the longest, since his unconvincing title win over Andy Ruiz those years back. And that's been the case since this past weekend. And yes, I mentioned both winning efforts, but it didn't win him over any fans outside of his native country. Fa seems to have a bit more spite at times, but he failed to showcase that in this fight against Parker, and that's what I was addressing. And again, this isn't a criticism of them as people, but if they are going to win consistently at the top level and entertain along the way, they have to be more than just decent guys. Anyway, coming up this week, we have a couple of interesting fights. Nothing major. We've been spoiled the last few weeks, but now it's dying down a little bit, but there's some interesting ones. On Thursday on NBC, this will be taking place in Puerto Rico. We have a prospect unbeaten 18-0 with 18 knockouts going by the name of Sergey El Flaco Bohachuk. He will be taking on former title challenger Brandon Adams, a decent fighter who should give him something of a test, getting near the top level. Also featured on the card will be son of Fernando Vargas Jr., who is 1-0 with 1 KO, and we'll be seeing how his career can progress in his second professional bout. Following day on Friday, airing on paper, it's a unification bout between Clarissa Shields and Marie-Eve Dakar, which will be taking place, as mentioned, in Flint, Michigan. It's a unification bout, which is always going to be pretty exciting, of course. And of course, this will be for a total unification of the junior middleweight titles for women's boxing, which, of course, if successful, Shields will have now unified 2 separate divisions, as well as having tremendous amateur success with gold medals. I mean, she is definitely building a legacy here if successful on Friday night. Anyway, that is just about it, so be sure to let me know what you thought of the Canelo performance. Who do you think he should be facing later this year? Saunders is pretty much a lock already for May 8th, so who do you think he should be facing in September as well as December? And what do you think of Clarissa Shields as well as her possibility of, potentially unifying the 2 divisions? And let me know what you think of Joseph Parker as well as Junior Fa going forward. We'd love to hear all of that stuff down in the comments. Be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, all of that great stuff. Really appreciate it. Follow me on Twitter at jcalderon_JOB. You can also email me at jonboxing@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you, and until next time.